the time. Travis would be incorporated in the larger DC universe, with the mantle of the Crimson Avenger being carried over for several generations and even taken a supernatural turn, when Joe Carlisle, first appearing in Stars and Stripes #9 in April of 2000, taking up the mantle recently, becoming DC's Spirit of Vengeance. However, all this changed on May of 1939 when Batman debuted in Detective Comics #27 by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. While initially a masked detective in the same vein as the Clock and the Crimson Avenger, along with a heavy influence from pulp heroes like the Shadow, Batman eventually became a full-on superhero on par with Superman, for which he was originally mandated to compete with. Soon, all masked detectives would follow, morphing or being replaced by the rising superhero genre, and in Detective Comics' case would become a full-on Batman series by issue number 35 on January of 1940, and has remained so to this day. Batman is still allowed to reference his masked detective roots, though, as he is a superhero in the DC, usually called upon for his deductive reasoning, and one of his nicknames is the Dark Knight Detective. On January 1940, Pep Comics and their publisher Archie Comics debuted The Shield as G-Man Extraordinaire, though he's really more of a superhero. Created by writer William Harry Shorten and artist Ira Norvik, he was originally Joe Higgins, the son of Lieutenant Tom Higgins, who was working on a formula to give people super strength. After German saboteurs kill him in the Black Tom explosion, a real explosion carried out by German saboteurs in 1916 during the World War I, Tom is blamed for it. His son, Joe, continues perfecting the formula, which ultimately gives him super strength and invulnerability. He joins the FBI with his secret identity known only to the director J. Edgar Hoover, working to fight criminals while clearing his father's name. The character has made sporadic appearances throughout comic books ever since, and DC even planned to incorporate him into his comic book line before the rights reverted back to Archie in 2011. While The Shield is only a crime comic book by his association, the FBI, he is not only represents superheroes replacing masked detectives, but he's also one of the first patriotic heroes to appear in comic books, preceding Captain America by over a year, who first appeared in March of 1941. Nick Carter, the longest-running American detective series, has first appeared on September 18, 1886, in the story paper New York Weekly, Volume 41, number 46, made his jump into comic books as part of Doc Savage Comics from 1940 to 49. He was created by John Russell Corlell and Ormond G. Smith, the son of one of the founders of Street and Smith Publishers, who produced the series. And originally he was more in the vein of science detective Doc Savage before being revamped as a hard-boiled gumshoe, accompanied by Patsy, a comely blonde sidekick who was originally a boy Blue-Black in the novels. Carter was also drawn taller from his character from the novels, with a mustache and graying hair at the temples, and acknowledges of the character's longevity. Nick Carter was also appeared in the Shadow comic and Army and Navy comics, along with an Italian comic strip in 1972. Ellery Queen, the classic detective who wrote his own stories, his name was a pseudonym for his creators' names, Frederick Denis and Manfred Bennigan Lee, appeared in May 1940 in Crackerjack Comics before getting his own comic book 4-issue series from Superior in 1949. Ziff Davis produced a 2-issue series in 1952, while Dell would produce their 3 comics of the character in 1962. While popular detective The Golden Era of detective fiction, complete with exotic locations and clues, revealed the Queen at the same time as the reader sees them, thus giving the reader a chance to solve the mystery for themselves. He also only made sporadic appearances in mentions in comics. Most recently, his name was dropped in Case Closed, also known as Detective Conan in Japan, the Detective Manga series in Volume 11 of the Goshu Anomo's Mystery Library section, where the author introduces different character from a detective literature. In Volume 12, the character Hiji Hattori even says she prefers Queen over Sherlock Holmes. Another popular comic strip was Carrie Drake by writer Alan Sanders and artist Alfred Androl from October 4th, 1943 to 1983, where the character replaced Dan Dunn, reportedly when Dunn's creator Norman Marsh got into an argument with the publisher syndicate. Originally a detective with the district attorney's office, he joins the police force after his fiancée is killed, taking on criminals like Dr. Prey and No-Face. What made Drake different was the emphasis on actual police techniques in solving complex cases. Plus, in an acknowledgement to his longevity, the character has developed a personal life, eventually marrying and having quadruplets, with him naturally having to balance professional and personal responsibilities. His younger brother, David, otherwise known as Lefty, would take over the more dangerous assignments in response. The Saint, the Robin Hood-like criminal Simon Templar, first appeared in comic strips on September 27, 1948, with Leslie Charteris, who also wrote Secret X9 after Dashiell Hammett left, and various artists throughout its run, which ended on September 16, 1961. He made his jump to comic books on February of 1942 in Silver Streak Comics, while Charteris also wrote 4 of the stories, while Ed Ash did illustrations. The Saint then got his own comic book in 1947 from Avon Comics, producing 12 issues over a period of 5 years till 1952. He has had sporadic appearances in comic books since, most notably in a long-running series in Sweden under the name Huguenot, which lasted from 1966 to 1985. Of course, arguably the most popular fictional detective of all time, Sherlock Holmes, would join the comic book fold. He first got his own comic strip in 1939, which was copyrighted by his creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself, and lasted until 1932. He made his first comic book appearance in July of 1944 in Famous Mysteries, which ran to August of 1953. Since then, Holmes has made numerous appearances throughout comic books, notably a cameo in The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which retold a scene from the story The Final Problem. Other private eyes like Mike Hammer and Johnny Dynamite also appeared in comics. Mike Hammer, the hard-boiled detective created by Mickey Spillane, who previously wrote the short-lived Mike Danger detective strip in 1947, had a short-lived comic book strip from Phoenix Features Syndicate from 1953 to 54, titled From the Files of Mike Hammer, while Walt Kelly would use his strip Pogo to parody the character in 1955. Johnny Dynamite was the original comic book detective created by writer Ken Finch and artist Peter Morrissey, appearing in Dynamite's number 3 and through 9 from Comics Medium and his own title in number 10 through 12 by Charlton Comics in 1953. However, this one-eyed detective stories featured rampant sex and violence, and once the CCA went into effect, it wasn't long before Dynamite would have to change with the times. He would later appear in Charlton's Foreign Intrigues, number 13 to 15 in 1956, where he fought behind the Iron Curtain. Max Allen Collins would acquire the rights to the character in 1987 from Charlton and reprinted his stories in his Mrs. Tree series. Later, Collins and artist Terry Betty did a 4-issue miniseries for Dark Horse Comics in 1994. Spicy Detective was a classic example of pulp magazines at the time, with covers of scantily clad women in distress coupled with detective stories inside. The covers were provided by the Majestic Studios, a tiny art shop run by Adolphe Barreau, who, after seeing how well the covers did with the audiences, started providing a comic strip for the magazine. Sally the Sleuth, a blonde bombshell detective who always manages to lose her clothes during an investigation but still manages to get her man in the end. For example, in her first story, A Narrow Escape, Sally is in the middle of putting on a disguise to infiltrate some drug smugglers, only to be kidnapped and tied up with her bra exposed, and later rescued by her boss at the detective agency. The strip would continue for 10 years with similar stories. However, bowing to community pressers, Spicy Detective was renamed Speed Detective on January 1943, with milder covers and content, along with Sally the Sleuth, who started to keep her clothes on more in an expanded 4-page strip. With the growing success of comics in the comic book genre in general, publisher Frank Armour worked with Adolphe Barreau, who made his comic book editor and launched Trojan Comics, releasing Crime Smashers on October 1950 and then Western Crime Smasher the previous September. As for Sally the Sleuth, she was brought back in full color in Crime Smashers with both reprints of the original strip and new stories by Keith Petrie and Perry Carpenter, and later appearing in Crime Mysteries from Trojan Comics as well. Keeping with community pressure, she was more demure, and though she wore a tight red dress, Sally managed to keep it on most of the time. She was also less likely to be kidnapped as well, as she was now carrying a gun and knew how to use it. Despite this start, Sally the Sleuth would be a Blake Drew comic book character in being a female crime fighter, paving the way for other female detectives like Toni Gale and Young King Cole Comics, a professional model and freelancing detective, and Carrie Kane, who started out as a secondary feature in the Charlie Chan comic book, starring a woman who becomes a private detective after her sister, a policewoman, is killed in the line of duty. It wasn't his cops and detectives getting into the adaptation treatment, though, as lawyers like Perry Mason got a comic strip by King Features Syndicate in 1946, along with a comic book the following year, which adapted his novels The Case of the Lucky Legs, which was first published in 1933, and The Case of the Shoplifter Shoes from 1938. This Mason, though, was far more physically active than the typical lawyer, or the character from the TV and radio series, as on his cover debut of Lucky Legs, he's seen punching out a suspect. Perry Mason would later get another comic book adaptation in 1964 thanks to the immense popularity of his TV show starring Raymond Burr, which went so far as to use photos of Burr on the covers. However, despite these numerous comics and adaptations, one comic book would truly change the crime genre of comic books in general, and that was Crime Does Not Pay. The comic was published by Lev Gleason Publications, whose owner, Gleason, hired Charles Barrow and Bob Wood to edit his Daredevil and Silver Streak comics in 1941, complete with profit sharing and creative credits. With this incentive, Gleason encouraged Barrow and Wood to create even more titles. Reportedly, Barrow and Wood went out to a bar to talk, where Barrow told a story about how he was approached by a nervous man one night who offered him a woman up in his apartment. Barrow declined, and the next day he read in the paper that the man was arrested, having kidnapped the woman he kept tied up in his room. Both he and Wood found the encounter astounding and brainstormed an idea for a comic book that focused on criminals and the bad guys. Barrow insisted crime had to be in the title, and they created Crime Does Not Pay, which featured just such stories. It was inspired by an MG docudrama series in 1935 of the same name, which covered similar subject matter. The film series was even endorsed by FBI director J. Edgar Hoover and went on to win Oscars in 1936 and 1937 for Best Short Film. Simply put, the comic had a recognizable title ready to go. Crime Does Not Play would replace Silver Streak comic books with issue number 22 in June of 1942, though it kept the numbering, a common practice with comic books at the time, and was, as the creators intended, told stories based on real crime cases. The first issue featured articles about and stories about real criminals written by Barrow and Wood, such as Louis Bolecker, Diamond Joe Esposito, and Wild Bill Hickok. Barrow designed and drew the first cover as well. Called the first magazine of its kind, it was targeted at adult audiences and was an outgrowth of the true crime magazines like True Detective Mysteries and Crime Detective. On November of 1942, with issue number 24, the series added a narrator with Mr. Crime, who was inspired by the Mr. Coffee Nerds character from the advertisements. Depicted as a ghost-like narrator in a white sheet and top hat with crime written on it, he was an envious narrator to crime stories, sometimes cheering on the criminals, but ultimately, when they got their punishments, pronouncing the series' title and theme, Crime Does Not Pay. Mr. Crime would actually be one of the earliest comic book narrators for anthologies, predating the EC horror hosts like The Crypt Keeper and The Old Witch, and would later inspire Rod Sterling's own narration for his classic The Twilight Zone TV series. Crime Does Not Pay was also added to feature Who Did It Mystery, which invited readers to help solve crimes. In 1945, What's on Your Mind was added as a letters column for the magazine, with readers writing how the series kept them from committing crime. However, each letter that was printed received a $2 reward. The comic was an instant success, selling 200,000 copies with the first issue before growing to 800,000 in sales by 1946. However, its success was also followed by controversy when in August of 1947, two men were sent to prison for extortion in Atlanta, Georgia, and they claimed they got the idea from reading Crime Does Not Pay. The comic had previously defended the violence in the November 1943 issue, though the comic's art moved from cartoony to realistic. Despite this bad press, Crime Does Not Pay would soon break 1 million in sales by 1948. By the end of World War II, the medium had seen a complete shift to crime comic books, and Crime Does Not Pay claimed it was now selling 5 to 6 million issues a month, though it never really moved higher than 1 million. There were now 150 new titles that year, along with movies following the crime genre as well. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby produced Clue Comics and Headline Comics, along with Justice Traps the Guilty on May of 1947. Jack Cole did The Manhunters and for Top Notch Comics on December 1939, and Crime on the Run from Blue Luring Comics on November of 1939. On September of 1947, Wanted Comics was produced, hosted by Sadie himself, and was notable for putting an actual wanted poster on the cover of a known criminal with a $1,000 reward. Official True Crime Comics premiered in fall of 1947, replacing the Submariner at Timely, the future Marvel, while Justice Comics replaced Wacky Duck. On April of 1948, Crime Fighters was added, along with Crime Exposed and Lawbreakers on the Loose. Soon, in classic Timely tradition of imitating the current trends in comics under its owner, Martin Goodman, it was publishing more crime comic books than any other publisher. National, the future DC, joined in with Gangbusters in December of 1947 and Mr. D.A. on January 1948, both based on the radio shows and later TV series. The D.A. character was actually based on Thomas Dewey, the famous district attorney and future governor of New York. Big Town premiered on January 1950. With all these imitators, Crime Does Not Pay mocked them with titles like Crime Does Pay and numerous others. And with that, we'll conclude for now, as the crime comic book genre is now in full swing. However, they will soon get some backlash with the Comics Code Authority and the CCA, and of course, everyone's favorite comic book critic, Frederick Warburton. And now it is February 21st,